There are names in history that survive because of triumph. And then there are names that survive because of one terrible decision. Pontius Pilate was not an emperor. He was not a conqueror. He did not build an empire, discover a continent, or write a philosophy that changed the world. He was, in many ways, exactly the kind of man history usually forgets. A provincial Roman governor, a career official, a man sent to a difficult land to do a difficult job for a distant emperor, and yet 2,000 years later, people who know almost nothing about ancient Rome still know his name. Not because he ruled well, not because he ruled long, but because one morning in Jerusalem, standing between imperial power and a bound prisoner from Galilee, Pontius Pilate made a choice that would echo farther than the voice of Caesar, farther than the marble halls of Rome, farther even than his own imagination could ever reach. This is the complete story of Pontius Pilate. Part 1. The man before the legend. Before he became a symbol, before he became a villain in sermons or a tragic figure in paintings, Pontius Pilate was simply a Roman. And that matters. Because to understand Pilate, you have to understand Rome. Rome did not build its empire on sentiment. It built it on order, on obedience, on rank, on the cold, practical belief that peace was something enforced, not negotiated. Pilate came from that world. Most historians believe he belonged to the Roman equestrian class, a tier below the senatorial elite, but still high enough to hold serious power. He was not a nobody, but he was not untouchable either. Men like Pilate survived by proving useful. They did the unpleasant work. They governed restless territories. They collected taxes. They kept trade routes open. And when necessary, they crushed resistance without hesitation. Britannica, we know frustratingly little about his early life. We do not know what kind of child he was. We do not know the voice of his father, the shape of his home, or whether he ever dreamed of greatness. History, cruel as always, rarely preserves the private world of bureaucrats. But we can imagine the ladder he climbed. A Roman education, military discipline, political connections. The slow, deliberate shaping of a man who learned that advancement came not from kindness, but from competence. Perhaps he learned early that mercy was admired in poetry, but not always rewarded in government. Perhaps he learned that to rise in Rome, a man had to be harder than the men beneath him and more useful than the men beside him. At some point, that path brought him into imperial service, and eventually it led him to Judea. Not a rich posting, not an easy posting, certainly not a peaceful one. Judea was a tense, volatile province under Roman domination, watched by a people who believed in one God, cherished their ancestral law, and deeply resented pagan occupation. Pilate was appointed prefect of Judea under Emperor Tiberius, serving roughly from 26 to 36 CE. Archaeological evidence from Caesarea supports his historical office and title. Britannica PBS frontline. To Rome, it was another territory. To the Jews, it was a holy land, and that difference would define everything. So when Pilate arrived, he did not come as a pilgrim. He did not come as a student of local custom. He came as Rome, with soldiers, with authority, with the emperor's interests in his hands. And perhaps from the very beginning, he misunderstood the land he had been sent to govern. Or perhaps, and this is more unsettling, he understood it perfectly, and simply did not care. Part 2. Judea, a province ready to burn. To an outsider, Jerusalem must have seemed magnificent and impossible all at once. A sacred city full of prayers, sacrifices, festivals, and memory. A city where theology lived in the streets. A city where politics and religion were so tightly woven together that to offend one was to ignite the other. For Rome, the mission was simple: keep order. But in Judea, order was never simple. The Jewish population lived under the shadow of empire while clinging fiercely to religious identity. Roman standards, imperial images, taxes, and pagan symbolism were not just political irritants, they were spiritual provocations. Pilate's tenure is remembered in ancient sources for repeated clashes with Jewish sensitivities, including controversies over imperial symbols and public works financed with sacred funds. Britannica, MDPI. Pilate's official residence was in Caesarea by the sea, not Jerusalem. That alone says something. Jerusalem was holy. Caesarea was Roman. There, among administrative buildings and imperial architecture, Rome looked like itself. But whenever Pilate entered Jerusalem, especially during feast seasons, he walked into a city swollen with pilgrims, prophecy, memory, and potential unrest. Passover was the most dangerous time. Thousands came to remember liberation from foreign rule. And Rome, of course, was foreign rule. You can almost feel the tension. A Roman governor watching crowds gather to celebrate God delivering his people from an empire. A people reciting stories about freedom while standing under occupation. Every festival was devotion. Every festival was also a risk. Pilate likely knew this, and still, he ruled with the instincts of a man trained by empire, not by diplomacy. Ancient writers like Josephus and Philo portray him as stubborn, provocative, sometimes brutal, yet also capable of pragmatic retreat when resistance threatened greater instability. Modern scholarship often sees in these portraits not a cartoon villain, but a hard Roman official whose priority was order, loyalty to Caesar, and control. Britannica MDPI. That is what makes Pilate fascinating. He was not merely cruel. Cruel men are easy to understand. He was something more complicated. A man powerful enough to kill, clever enough to calculate, and limited enough to believe that political survival was the highest good. And in places like Judea, men like that always leave scars. Part 3. The standards, the symbols, and the first cracks. Soon after Pilate took office, he made one of the moves that would define his reputation. Roman troops entered Jerusalem bearing imperial standards, military emblems associated with the emperor. To Roman eyes, such imagery signified loyalty and sovereignty. To many Jews, it was a violation, an intrusion of idolatrous symbolism into the holy city. Josephus records that the outrage was immediate and intense, and that Pilate eventually backed down after Jewish protesters showed they would rather die than accept the insult. Britannica. This is the kind of episode that reveals a man. Imagine Pilate receiving the complaints. Maybe at first he was annoyed, maybe amused. These provincial people, so easily offended, so dramatic, so inflexible. Rome ruled continents. Surely Jerusalem could survive a few standards. But then something happened that he may not have expected. The Jews did not riot in blind rage. They did something more unsettling. They endured. They protested with determination so absolute that according to Josephus, many laid bare their necks and declared they were ready to die rather than submit. That kind of resistance was hard for Rome to classify. Rebellion could be crushed, but what do you do with a people who will not attack and will not bend? Britannica. Pilate blinked. The images were removed. For some, that moment might suggest weakness, for others, practicality. But maybe it was the first real lesson Judea taught him. This province would not behave like the others. Here, men could be ruled by force, but not easily mastered in spirit. And Pilate, rather than learning reverence, seems to have learned irritation, because the conflicts did not stop. Another incident involved funds taken from the temple treasury for the construction of an aqueduct. Josephus says the decision led to public outrage, and Pilate's response was ruthless. Soldiers disguised in civilian clothing mingled with protesters, and on his signal beat many of them, some to death. A later archaeological study has suggested that an aqueduct from the early 1st century may indeed be associated with Pilate's period of rule. Biblical Archaeology Society, Britannica. And there he is again, the Roman administrator in full. Build the infrastructure. Take the money. Ignore the outrage. Crush the dissent. In another remembered controversy, Philo preserves a tradition about gilded shields associated with Pilate and imperial honor in Jerusalem, again highlighting the governor's disregard for Jewish sensitivities and the political fallout of symbolic offense. By now, a pattern had emerged. Pilate would provoke. The people would react. Pilate would either punish or retreat. He was not insane. He was not random. He was a Roman governor trying to establish the undeniable supremacy of empire in a land that measured authority by holiness. And that kind of collision never stays small. Part 4. The weight of office. It is easy, looking back, to flatten Pilate into a single trait. Coward, monster, bureaucrat, weakling, executioner. But real people rarely fit so neatly inside one word. Pilate lived under pressure too. Above him was Tiberius, emperor of Rome. Far above him, yes, but still above. And in Rome, favor could evaporate overnight. Appointments were political. Careers were fragile. If order failed in your province, your enemies in the capital would hear about it. Some historians note that Pilate may have initially benefited from the patronage network surrounding Sejanus, the powerful favorite of Tiberius. After Sejanus fell from power in 31 CE, the political atmosphere grew more dangerous for imperial officials linked to him, and Pilate may have become more vulnerable to criticism from local elites and Roman superiors. Britannica. That matters, because by the time the most famous prisoner of his career was brought before him, Pilate may have already known what it meant to govern under suspicion. Not fear exactly, but exposure. The knowledge that power is never as secure as it looks in public. And perhaps that is why the story of Jesus and Pilate does not feel like a simple clash between good and evil. It feels like something more human, a collision between innocence and expediency, between truth and office, between a man with moral authority and a man with legal authority. And history remembers which authority looked stronger that morning. But it also remembers which one lasted longer. Part 5. The morning Jerusalem changed forever. It began, as history-changing moments often do, with a procedure. A prisoner brought in, charges presented, a governor asked to confirm or deny the state's judgment. Jesus of Nazareth was handed over to Pilate during his governorship, placing the crucifixion firmly within Pilate's years in office. The gospel accounts consistently depict Pilate questioning Jesus, hearing accusations from local religious authorities, offering the crowd a choice between Jesus and Barabbas, and ultimately authorizing crucifixion. PBS Frontline Bible Gateway. Now picture it. The early light over Jerusalem. The governor already burdened with the tension of Passover. The priests and accusers already resolved. And in the middle of it all, a Galilean teacher standing bound, silent, and strangely calm. Pilate had seen men like this before, or so he probably thought. Prophets, troublemakers, messianic dreamers, men who stirred crowds and disturbed order. Rome dealt with such men efficiently. But then came the question that has lived for centuries. Are you the king of the Jews? In all four gospel traditions, this question, or its equivalent, stands at the center of Pilate's interrogation. Jesus answers in a way that is restrained, enigmatic, or deeply philosophical, depending on the gospel being read. John's account, in particular, expands the exchange into a meditation on truth, kingship, and a kingdom not of this world. Bible Gateway. What did Pilate see in him? A threat? A fool? A fanatic? Or something he could not quite categorize? Maybe that is why this scene has never lost its force. Pilate was trained to read danger. And yet Jesus does not behave like a dangerous man. He does not plead. He does not flatter. He does not tremble. There is instead a kind of unsettling composure. The Gospels repeatedly portray Pilate as saying he found no basis for a charge deserving death. Luke and John especially emphasize Pilate's repeated declarations of insufficient guilt. Yet all four narratives end the same way. Pilate yields to the crucifixion. This is where Pilate becomes more than a governor. This is where he becomes recognizable. Because who has not stood at the edge of a decision, knowing what is right, and calculating the cost of doing it? He tries exits, procedural exits, political exits, symbolic exits. One tradition says he sent Jesus to Herod Antipas, seeking jurisdictional distance. Another gives us the warning from his wife, troubled by a dream. Matthew alone records the famous gesture of hand-washing, while John preserves the bitter line, "What is truth?" These details vary in emphasis, but together they portray a governor searching for room to maneuver. Bible gateway. And then the crowd. Or perhaps more precisely, the crowd as political pressure. The priests, the accusations, the cries, "Crucify him." Pilate offers Barabbas. A custom, a compromise, a way out. But the way out closes. And you can almost feel the tightening of the trap, not around Jesus, but around Pilate. Because now the issue is no longer only guilt. It is loyalty, order, position, Caesar. John's account especially suggests that the charge was sharpened politically. If Pilate released a man accused of kingship, would that make him appear disloyal to Caesar? Scholars often note that this scene can be read not merely as Pilate's weakness, but as a calculation shaped by imperial interests and the risks of seeming soft on sedition. Britannica, MDPI. And so the Roman governor does what frightened officials have always done. He sacrifices the vulnerable to protect the system that protects him. He releases Barabbas. He orders Jesus flogged. And finally, he hands him over to be crucified. Bible gateway. No thunder cracks in the sky at that exact moment. No empire falls by evening. On paper, it may have looked like another provincial case closed. Just another execution. Just another day the machinery of Rome kept moving. And yet it was not. Because some decisions are larger than the men who make them. Part 6. What I have written, I have written. There is something chilling about how ordinary evil can appear in real time. A sentence written, a body prepared, soldiers carrying out orders, a governor moving on to the next matter. And still, even in the final stage, Pilate leaves one last mark on the story. According to John, he had an inscription placed on the cross, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." When local leaders objected and asked that it be changed to say Jesus only claims such a title, Pilate refused. "What I have written, I have written." What was that refusal? Mockery? Defiance? Spite? Perhaps all three. Even in surrender, Pilate wanted the last word. If he had been pressured, then he would answer pressure with humiliation. If the leaders had forced his hand, he would force them to look at the consequence nailed in public view. That is Pilate all over again. Not a noble man, not a principled man, but a proud one. A man who might bend, but only while leaving a wound behind. And then Jesus died. For Pilate, that should have been the end of it. The prisoner executed, the disturbance contained, the file closed. But history is full of moments when rulers believe they have buried a problem, only to discover they have planted a future. 8. Authorized did not disappear into silence. It became the center of a faith. And with that, the prefect of a minor province became part of the most repeated story on earth. Part 7. After the cross. Here's the haunting part. Pilate likely did not know that morning would define him forever. He probably returned to work. Reports, petitions, troop matters, taxes, routine. The empire did not pause because one more man had been crucified outside Jerusalem. And yet, the world beneath the surface was already changing. The followers of Jesus did not let the story die. They told it, retold it, prayed it, wrote it down. And every time they did, Pilate remained there. Not as a rumor, not as a distant emperor, but by name, Pontius Pilate. For a Roman official, that is almost ironic. He spent his career representing Caesar. But in the end, Caesar fades into the background of Christian memory, while Pilate's name is spoken in creeds, liturgies, sermons, and sacred reading across centuries. Think about that. How many governors of Judea can most people name? Only one. And not because he built anything that lasted, not because he loved justice, but because he stood near Jesus and chose safety over truth. There is a strange kind of immortality in that. Not honor, not glory, just permanence. And sometimes permanence is the heavier burden. Part 8. The Fall of Pilate. If the trial of Jesus made Pilate famous, it did not make his governorship successful. His career continued, and so did the unrest. Confrontation would end it. According to ancient accounts summarized by modern reference works, Pilate's final political downfall came after a violent episode involving Samaritans at Mount Gerizim around 36 CE. The Samaritans complained to Vitellius, the Roman legate of Syria, accusing Pilate of excessive cruelty and unlawful killings. Vitellius ordered Pilate back to Rome to answer for his conduct. Britannica. And there it is. The empire that had empowered him now called him to account. For 10 years he had balanced force and unrest, insult and retreat, authority and resentment. But provincial brutality was only useful so long as it served stability. When it became embarrassing, when complaints rose high enough, Rome could discard its own agents. Pilate, who had once judged others, was now the one summoned. Imagine that journey back. From Judea to Rome. From authority to uncertainty. A man used to command now traveling toward questions he could not control. What did he think on that road? Did he replay the years in his mind? The protests, the beatings, the Passover morning, the shouted demands, the washing of hands, the title on the cross? Did he justify himself? Did he still believe he had simply done what governors must do? We do not know. And history, at that point, becomes shadowy. Britannica notes that later tradition, especially through Eusebius, claims Pilate died by suicide under Caligula. But the certainty of that tradition is weak. What is solid is this. After his recall to Rome, the historical record becomes unclear, and Pilate disappears into ambiguity. Britannica, which feels strangely fitting. The man who enters history in a blaze of moral consequence exits it in fog. No grand final speech, no confirmed execution scene, no triumphant defense before the Senate. Just absence, just silence, the kind of silence history often gives to men who once thought themselves important. Part 9. The many Pilates. But Pilate did not truly disappear. He multiplied. The historical Pilate became many different Pilates in memory. To some, he was a cruel Roman prefect who despised the people under him. To others, he was a weak politician bullied by circumstance. In some Christian traditions, he became almost tragic, a man who recognized innocence but lacked the courage to act on it. In others, later legends softened his image so dramatically that he and his wife were treated sympathetically, with Pilate's wife receiving veneration in certain Christian traditions. Britannica. That is what happens to people who stand too close to sacred history. They stop belonging only to historians. They become mirrors. Every generation sees in Pilate the kind of failure it fears most. For some, Pilate represents political cowardice. For others, moral compromise. For others still, the terrifying normality of state violence, the way systems can kill through paperwork, hesitation, and public pressure rather than personal rage. And maybe that is why he still feels modern. Because Pilate is not merely the man who asked, "What is truth?" He is the man who asked it while standing in front of truth and choosing convenience anyway. That is not just ancient, that is eternal. Part 10. The tragedy at the heart of his story. The complete story of Pontius Pilate is not really the story of a monster. Monsters let us feel safe. They reassure us that evil is obvious. Pilate is more disturbing than that. He is recognizable. He is the official who does not want trouble. the manager who knows better but signs anyway, the politician who sees innocence and calculates optics, the judge who fears the crowd, the career man who tells himself that one compromised decision is only temporary, only procedural, only necessary. Pilate's tragedy is not that he lacked power. By Roman standards he had plenty. His tragedy is that he used power without moral courage. The Gospels remember him hesitating, probing, questioning, and yet finally surrendering Jesus to death. Historical readings of Pilate suggest that whether from cynicism, calculation, or fear of appearing disloyal to Caesar, he chose imperial stability over justice. Bible Gateway MDPI. And that is why history never releases him. Because deep down, we know that civilization is rarely destroyed only by fanatics. It is also damaged by functionaries, by men who shrug, by men who defer, by men who know the difference between right and wrong, but decide the moment is inconvenient. Pilate did not write the creed, but his name entered it. He did not found a faith, but that faith preserved him. He did not conquer death, but his decision became part of the story through which millions speak about life, death, justice, guilt, sacrifice, and redemption. That is the paradox of Pontius Pilate. He tried to preserve his position and lost his reputation. He tried to end a problem and helped create a movement. He tried to wash his hands, and history remembered the stain. Ending. So who was Pontius Pilate? A Roman prefect, a political realist, a hard provincial ruler, a man of empire, a man out of sympathy with the people he governed, a judge who saw enough to hesitate, but not enough, or not bravely enough, to refuse. He was powerful but not free, practical but not wise, memorable, though not for the reasons he would have chosen. And perhaps that is the final lesson of his life. You do not need to be the most powerful person in history to shape history forever. Sometimes all it takes is one chair of judgment, one fearful morning, one innocent man, and one decision made for the sake of order. And after that, whether you like it or not, the world remembers your name, Pontius Pilate. Not because he won, but because at the moment that mattered most, he failed.